Hello, thanks for joining Clean Air Task Force's first state policy webinar of our 2025 webinar series. I'm Jeremy Tarr. I'm the State Policy Director here at CATF. We've chosen clean electricity standards as the first topic for our webinar series for a couple of reasons. First, it's a topic that's been of interest and focus by CATF for a number of years. Second, in the past month, we've released a handful or a couple of really great resources that we want to feature and make sure you're aware of. One is a report that's directed at policymakers and stakeholders interested in clean electricity standards. And the second is a interactive map who my colleague Paula Cobb will explain later in the webinar. We are going to follow up with a recording of this for you all by email, and we will also include the slide deck, so you will have access to that. For those of you who aren't familiar with Clean Air Task Force, we are a global environmental organization. We have offices in Washington, D.C., Boston, Brussels, and we have staff working virtually throughout the world. Our mission is to push the technology and policy changes that are needed to achieve a zero emission, high energy planet at an affordable cost. Presenters on the webinar today include myself, Sean Goho, who is our legal director, Paula Leverett Cobb, who is our senior Southeast Regional Policy Manager, and Kasparis Spokas is available to help answer any questions. Kasparis is our director of the electricity program. So here's the run through that we have planned for you. I'm gonna give you tell you a little bit more about the webinar series, and then I'll do a brief introduction on clean electricity standards and some of the benefits of them. We are then going to get to the meat of the presentation, which will go through about a dozen different policy design options for states considering a clean electricity standard. And then we're going to have a walkthrough of the clean electricity standard map that you can use the chat to type in any questions that you have, and we'll have a decent amount of time at the end to answer any questions that you all have. All right, so as I mentioned, we have this 2025 state policy webinar series that we are launching today. The audience here is really for lawmakers, state officials, stakeholders, and wanting to provide you all with actionable information on timely state policy topics. The presentations across our series this year are going to be by experts at Clean Air Task Force, also other organizations. We may have state officials involved to give presentations. We're going to cover topics in the electricity sector about transportation, land, and industrial sectors. We may also focus on specific technologies and policies. So our cadence is going to be about every other month throughout the year. The next webinar, though, is going to be next month, and that's going to be focused on clean, firm electricity supply and load growth, topics that are of growing significance to many of us who are involved in power sector technology deployment and emission reductions. All right, so let's move to the first topic, which is a brief introduction to clean electricity standards. A clean electricity standard, as we think about it at Clean Air Task Force, is a policy that's really designed to increase the share of electricity generated from resources that have zero or near zero emissions. The benefit of these is they ultimately reduce greenhouse gas emissions and other pollutants while ensuring reliability, flexibility, affordability, and foster economic growth. There's an interesting story here that started in the early 2000s that kind of begins with renewable portfolio standards and then shifts over to clean electricity standards. An renewable portfolio standard is a market-based strategy that is designed to increase the generation of electricity from renewable sources. Typically, that's going to be wind and solar. Sometimes it includes additional renewable energy resources. So under an RPS, the regulated company has to obtain a specified percentage of electricity for retail sales that comes from renewable sources. And generally, the percentage of renewable energy that must be sold increases over time. RPSs have been successful. They have been adopted by more than half states and have been a strong contributor to the growth in renewable energy capacity and generation that we've seen over the past couple of decades. This is a great slide, and credit to the Berkeley Lab for putting it together. It was just updated this past summer. And what you can see here is that on the top left in the blue states indicates states that have passed a renewable portfolio standard and the year of passage. So you see kind of late 90s into the early 2000s. And then below the line in red are when states have undergone major revisions to the renewable portfolio standard. Then you see starting in 2017, 2018 in yellow that states started passing clean electricity standards. And that's what we're going to talk about today. So let's go to the next slide. In the context of existing RPSs, a clean electricity standard can either supplant an existing RPS or supplement the existing RPS. You could also have a clean electricity standard with no RPS. You could just have kind of no policy and then start with a clean electricity standard. What we've seen is that an effective clean electricity standard has essentially three characteristics. One, it sets an enforceable requirement to transition to clean electricity. Second, it recognizes and includes a broad range of clean electricity technologies, not just renewable energy. And third, it establishes ambitious targets, either for electricity resources or for emission reductions, and that these targets generally get tighter over time. By enabling a broader suite of clean electricity resources, including but beyond renewables, that gives states and utilities flexibility to achieve their clean energy objectives or technology innovation objectives according to their own distinct resources, their own market conditions, and their own local political considerations. In terms of benefits of a clean electricity standard, having a long-term target for these clean electricity resources provides long-term kind of certainty that helps with planning and investment decisions. So it encourages more investment in clean electricity resources than one would see without such a standard. Second, you get consumer savings. CESs can reduce customers' exposure to fuel price volatility and lower operating costs, and also has the ability to attract federal funding to help mitigate ratepayer costs. Third, you also see economic growth. So with CESs, what follows is more clean electricity resources and investment that leads to local economic impact, associated jobs. And then you have health and environmental improvements as you're moving from emitting fossil resources like coal or gas to clean electricity, low and zero emitting resources. There are commensurate public health and emission reductions. This includes for communities that may live near emitting resources. The degree of impact is going to depend on a variety of factors, the nature of the fossil or emitting resource that's coming offline or being retired, the density of the population, the proximity of the population to the generation resource, and other factors. So let's move now to kind of the second part of the presentation where we're going to go through 12 policy design options. And before we get started, let me tee up a little bit about this next section and this part of the report. So in our CES report, the purpose of it is really to be a useful go-to resource for folks, whether you're a lawmaker, state official, a stakeholder of whatever variety interested in clean electricity standards. When a state is considering a new CES or updating its CES, it encounters a number of decision points. And so this paper and our presentation here really identifies 12 of the key ones and sort of names them, explains what they are, and then it discusses options for the state. Decision point one, you could do option A or B or C, and talks about some of the considerations for each of those. And we think that this is going to help, folks in the ecosystem of developing clean electricity standards be smarter about them and help kind of do a sober assessment of what's going to make the most sense in terms of policy design for a particular state. All right, so let's go to the next slide. The first design option that we're going to discuss is what we call the form of the standard. So there are two different varieties of clean electricity standards. One we call an energy-based CES. Under this variety, the clean electricity standard is based on the amount of clean electricity that is provided to customers. Under this variety, the state would need to decide, kind of define what constitutes clean, what types of resources. So an energy-based CES is one where it would be in terms of an increasing percentage of clean energy over time. So you have to define what is clean energy. And that, again, could be a range of resources: wind, solar, nuclear, geothermal, gas plants with high levels of carbon capture, etc. The second variety is what we call an emissions-based CES. These CES policies are designed in a way that require increasing percent reduction of greenhouse gas emissions over time. Under this variety, you don't need to define what technologies are considered clean, because you're just measuring like emissions. And so if you shift from a dirtier to a cleaner or zero emission resource, then the emission benefits of those will be captured in the overall emission profile of the covered resources. What you do have to determine is what the baseline year is. So if it requires 80% reduction by 2030, you would pick, say from 2005 levels would be an example of a baseline. The second design feature is kind of what I mentioned earlier, which is if you have an energy-based CES, then you need to determine, and usually this is done in the statute, in the CES statutory authority, what constitutes clean electricity. I think I covered that. So let's go to the third one, which is about stringency. So this is getting to the point where the policy, whether it's about an increasing percentage of clean energy over time or decreasing emissions from the power sector over time, the state would need to determine what the percentage is, like the stringency. And typically, what we think ideally is the policy would have a long-term, like say 2040, 2045, 2050 requirement of getting to 100%, and then have interim steps along the way. Maybe it's 2030, 2040, 2035. And so having that mix of long-term and near-term requirements, there are a couple of benefits. So with the long-term requirements, it's really providing clear market signals to technologies that are currently commercially available, that there is a market for them long time, and it's worth doing the planning and the siting and the getting authorization, even if it will take a number of years to get them online. But also for emerging technologies like fusion or enhanced geothermal or super hot rock, that when those become commercially available, that there is going to be a market for them and they can count on that requirement. Having interim or near term targets helps ensure that the power sector is on track starting today, that it's not just kind of holding its breath waiting to the 2040s. We're actually making meaningful directional changes today and are getting near-term reductions and technology deployment as a result. The fourth policy design option that we're going to talk about is the point of regulation. So here, the point of regulation, we use that term to refer to the entity that has the compliance obligation. So like in vertically integrated state, for example, that would be, the utility would have the obligation to meet the CES requirement. In a deregulated state, the CES could apply to the distribution utility or the retail provider of electricity and require them to deliver an increasing percentage of clean energy over time. And so say the distribution utility or retail provider would then procure clean electricity from generators like independent power producers to make sure that the regulated entity is providing a sufficient amount of clean electricity over time. So this point of regulation also kind of interacts with an energy-based CES or emissions-based CES construct. With the energy-based CES, again, it would prefer clean energy technologies and tie compliance to the retail sales. So some interesting dynamics with this one. You could lean on the entity with the distribution utility, for example, could use out-of-state generation to comply, because really the compliance is just based on the sales. In fact, if it used emitting out-of-state generation and sold that in the state, then the emission profile of the out-of-state generation resources would count toward CES compliance. And so this dynamic helps control leakage because the power provider is responsible for the emissions associated with the generation outside of the state that it sells in the state. Under an emission-based CES, it really regulates in-state generators and links compliance to their emissions. So some interesting dynamics with this one are that, say you have a state with a 100% clean energy goal by the legislature or an executive order. That's typically in terms of total emissions. And so if you have an emission-based CES, which is requiring an increasing reduction of emissions over time, that's sort of apples to apples to the greenhouse gas reduction goal or requirement that a state may already have. It also it covers in-state emissions. And so if there is a state that is generating electricity in-state for export, then the emissions-based CES would cover in-state generation, even if that electricity is exported and then consumed in another state. So the paper discusses some of these dynamics, but they are important ones to think through when designing or updating a state CES. And I'll turn it over to Sean for the next 4 policy design options.
Great. Thank you, Jeremy. Jeremy mentioned I'm Sean Goho. I'm the legal director here at CATF. I'm going to be covering the next 4 policy design options, which are on the next slide. The first 2 topics here, compliance and tracking, I'm going to talk about together. They're related to each other. So compliance involves both a consideration of which entity, which state agency is responsible for ensuring compliance, and then also questions of what are the consequences of non-compliance? How is non-compliance enforced? And then obviously you need a robust system of tracking to ensure that entities are in fact complying. So it's important to ensure that a system is set up and an entity is state agency is responsible for tracking compliance to ensure that the program retains its integrity. Now, most commonly, the Utilities Commission in a state is the sole regulator. That's what we've seen the most in reviewing state clean energy standards. However, sometimes the responsibility is divided between the Utilities Commission and the state's environmental agency. The role that the state environmental agency plays will depend on the form of the standard. So if you have a state that requires a percentage of sales to be from eligible sources in its CES, sometimes that calls for case-by-case determinations of whether a source is eligible. And usually in those states, the environmental agency would play a role in making that determination. So just to give an example, In some states, the CES will include biomass as an eligible resource, but only if the biomass that is being combusted comes from particular sources. Say it's waste or other, um, non-whole tree biomass in some cases. That means that someone needs to be responsible for ensuring that the biomass that is being burnt in the sources is in fact eligible biomass. Typically, it would be the state environmental agency that's responsible for tracking that rather than the Utilities Commission. And then if you have a state where the CES is based on a percentage reduction in greenhouse gas emissions over time, then also the environmental agency may be responsible for tracking and reporting those emissions. Another consideration in compliance is what will the consequences be for a utility or for another regulated entity that fails to meet its targets, whether you're dealing with an emissions-based or a source-based CES. Some states provide for what are called alternative compliance payments. These are typically payments that are set by the legislature on a dollars per kilowatt hour basis. So the utility be responsible for paying that amount based on the amount of electricity it's supplying that is not compliant. Sometimes, as I said, that dollar amount is set directly by the legislature. Sometimes the legislation provides that the Utilities Commission will determine the exact magnitude of the dollar per kilowatt hour payment. And then in other cases, the Utilities Commission is left with a lot more discretion to determine just on a case-by-case basis what the penalty amount would be for noncompliance. The next topic that we looked at as a policy design option is whether a state would include requirements that are specific to in-state generation. So it's possible that a state could choose to either carve out a particular percentage of the energy that must come from in-state generation, or to provide some kind of multiplier, some kind of benefit for including in-state generation. There are obviously local economic and job benefits from prioritizing in-state generation. However, it also must be considered that that in most of the country, the electrical grid is interconnected, and that any particular state will be drawing on electricity as generated in multiple states, and that sometimes the lowest cost option for complying will be generation that's out of state. And then in addition, there really are some legal considerations for states, and in particular, there is a constitutional doctrine known as the Dormant Commerce Clause, under which states are prohibited from discriminating against out-of-state or interstate commerce, and therefore limiting eligibility or providing a preference just to in-state generation could be something that would face legal challenges if states included in their CES. One thing we have seen in some states as a somewhat of an intermediate position is that instead of allowing compliance through purchasing, RECs, renewable energy credits that are from anywhere in the country, sometimes they're limiting them to electricity is generated just within the RTO or ISO in which the state is located. That way you can ensure that the eligible electricity is in fact being supplied to the state. That helps ensure that you're seeing genuine benefits rather than just paper benefits. That, of course, does not necessarily bring the same in-state economic or job benefits that you would see from a pure in-state requirement. And then the last topic on this slide is the flexibility for different types of providers. What we're really looking at here is that some states will slightly tailor their requirements to make them a bit different for investor-owned utilities versus municipal utilities versus rural electric co-ops. These providers are often of different sizes, have different types of customers, have different capacity to transition from their current electricity mix to something new. It's not one thing we've certainly seen in some states is that the rural co-ops and municipal providers are given a bit of extra time to hit the targets compared to the investor-owned utilities. So that's the kind of flexibility that could be introduced to ensure buy-in from all regulated utilities. We have also seen some cases where certain utilities are carved out from the requirements, for example, that they might apply only to investor-owned utilities. So there's flexibility there in determining the exact scope of coverage. Obviously, a CES is most effective if it does cover all utilities in the state, but there are different approaches that we've seen in states that have adopted CESs. So with that, I will hand it over to Paula to go on to the next slide.
Thank you, Sean. Appreciate it. So we've got a couple of more policy design options to consider. The first one I'll mention is cost containment and compliance flexibility. A tech neutral clean electricity standard is inherently already flexible. So the broader suite of technologies that are eligible to count toward compliance of that standard, the more flexibility a utility or power provider will have to comply with that standard. However, there are specific mechanisms that states can consider adopting to really guard against unintended consequences while still ensuring that utilities are, actually deploying new resources over time, new clean resources in particular. What we've seen most of all are cost and reliability off-ramps. So when there is a significant affordability issue that arises or a significant reliability consideration or reliability risk that arises, there, utilities basically have to make a case that these particular off-ramps are triggered, and then there are temporary reductions in either the target or the compliance date, for example. I'll also mention here the alternative compliance payments that Sean mentioned a little bit earlier. Those are typically preset amounts either in statute or rule or some other sort of regulatory mechanism. And when the cost of compliance exceeds that cost threshold, let's say $35 per megawatt hour, then the regulated entity will pay that particular alternative compliance payment in lieu of compliance with a specific CES milestone. And that can, again, help guard against some of those, potential cost or reliability implications, but still overall keep the state on track toward meeting the clean electricity standard and deploying those new resources. You also have cases where you've got aligned renewable energy standards or, renewable portfolio standards. And as Jeremy mentioned earlier, these can work in parallel with a clean electricity standard, and RPS can kind of be integrated or subsumed by that clean electricity standard. A clean electricity standard can evolve in a state without an RPS. So there are different forms, in how those particular standards do evolve. And they're not mutually exclusive, for example. And they can support different goals that the state might have. You also have carve-outs and other incentives that can specifically be built into the clean electricity standard. And these can be used, for example, to boost deployment of specific types of resources that a state might be particularly interested in incentivizing. It can include things like distributed generation, battery storage, offshore wind, clean hydrogen and geothermal, but it can also include long lead resources that might not play a critical role on the grid today, but the state knows that they have the potential to play a very powerful role on the grid in the future, and they want to make sure that there's progress toward deploying those particular resources. So that can be something like new nuclear, advanced nuclear. It could be fusion technologies, super hot rock, like Jeremy mentioned. And so this is one way that a state can recognize those specific resources and say, okay, we want to incentivize those in our particular region because they matter for economic reasons, emission reasons, innovative reasons, whatever the state's particular reason might be. But these kinds of carve-outs and incentives do bring trade-offs. And so as you're developing a policy in a state, you just need to make sure that you're balancing those trade-offs. So for example, as I mentioned earlier, the broader suite of technologies that are allowed toward compliance, the more flexibility utility or power provider has to meet that standard. And so when you're saying a specific part of the standard has to be met utilizing a specific technology, that can limit some of the compliance flexibility mechanisms within the state. It also might increase costs, at least in the short term, but really what a state is recognizing is the full value that that resource can bring to the grid long term, and saying, that's a worthwhile investment for our state and for our grid for both long-term affordability and long-term reliability. The last thing I'm going to mention are advanced design features. And these are kind of add-ons or additional policies that can work in parallel with a traditional clean electricity standard that can incentivize deployment of clean firm technologies, long duration storage technologies sooner than a typical CES would, and accelerate emissions reductions. So as an example, you have an hourly retail sales requirement. the clean electricity standards of today have annual requirements. Well, an hourly retail sales requirement would say, 8760 hours per year, 24/7. Those hours have to be met by clean electricity, hour by hour, not just, annual average. Now, this kind of standard can be implemented over time and get more stringent over time. So it wouldn't necessarily be all hours of the year right out the gate that would be covered by this kind of policy. A state can decide to slowly ramp that up, or a state can say, we want to target the likeliest, most polluting hours of the year, the most polluting 1,000 or 1,500 hours of the year, and require those particular hours of demand be met by clean electricity, rather than relying on more traditional resources that would come in and supplement renewable energy, for example, when it's not available. And so these kinds of features we have not really seen yet in clean electricity standards, but we are hearing more and more discussion around them as states want to make sure that there's clean electricity more often than not, and that they're able to realize those emissions reductions sooner rather than later. All right, I want to take the time now to walk you through our interactive map that we developed at CATF. And this is a map. This is, this visual here is what you'll see when you bring the map up. And we're really particularly interested in, like state officials can use this map as they're devising or updating their policies, or really any stakeholder that is interested in understanding the state of play on clean electricity standards within the country, and how the states have actually looked at these design elements that we've just discussed and then put them into action in their states within their standards. So you can see which states have adopted which policy. You can explore which design elements each state has chosen. You can even compare the various states' policies. And then you also can, you have this map feature, but you also can download a table of relevant information and work offline to really explore what states have done in their individual policies. All right, let's take a look at the map. We're going to do a live demonstration, so hopefully this works. All right, so when you click on the interactive map, this is the first screen that you're going to see when you pull this map up. And you'll see that we've got a couple of different tabs here for you to use. This initial Explore tab is really, we picked what the most popular questions tend to be about a state's policy. And so just for example, a very basic one, well, which state has an RPS, right? Which state has a CES? And at a glance, you can really get a good sense for coverage across the country with these particular policies. You can even see what form of standard they've chosen. Is it an emission-based standard? Is it an energy-based standard? What's being regulated? Is it retail sales or is it emissions? How are they, how are they tracking compliance in these individual states? And once you've really exhausted those high-level options, you can go to this other tab. It's the Customize tab here. And this really allows you to look at a variety of the different design elements that states have chosen. And you can look at it state by state. You can choose a particular state if you're interested, and I'm actually going to choose one in just a moment and walk you through it. You can choose a region. If you'd like to explore, let's just click on Northeast and you see how the map will toggle through these different fields here. Let me go back to blank. I would say the most interesting part of this Customize tab, though, is really a list of technologies here. And our thinking here was to be able to show which states have affirmatively said, yes, this is the technology that can comply toward our standard. You even have, just like a tech neutral. Is the state CES tech neutral? So allowing for the most technologies possible to count toward compliance with the standard. So that's a really fun tab to play with. Once you've picked the various things that you're interested in, let's just go back to tech neutral, for example. Let's click on yes. You can actually look at that in a list view as well. And this list view, brings up all the states that meet the particular design options that you've chosen. And then once you've got the data that you'd like to look at, you can then download that particular list and look at it offline. So let's go back to this Explore tab here. Let's just pick a state as an example to show you some of the functionality. Let's pick New Mexico. All right, so when you click on a particular state, what it'll bring up is a quick view. And when we were thinking about the design of this, I was actually imagining myself sitting in a legislative committee meeting where they're talking about a clean electricity standard, right? And someone brings up a state that has a standard. I've got my cell phone, that's what I've got. This is a really quick view of the lay of the land in the state. It's not going to include every single element related to the state's policy, but it will have the main targets. It'll have the timeframes. It'll have the eligible technologies. It'll have the point of regulation. And it'll, who is regulated, what percentage of sales are covered by like a renewable portfolio standard, for example, and just give you an at a glance lay of the land in that particular state. However, when you have time and you want to dig into that state more deeply, you can click here on the details page. It'll actually take you to a specific one-pager for that state's policies. This has the information on the map plus a little bit more, and it includes links to the state code, for example, and other resources that you might find really beneficial as you're trying to figure out, how states around you, for example, have developed their particular policies. All right. And these are just some of the views that we just went through. You can really customize your map view. You can customize your list view and then download that list. And then just working through the state examples that I just showed you. Finally, I just wanted to remind everyone of the resources we do have. And as Jeremy mentioned, we'll send a link to all of these resources to you. But we do have a technical report on clean electricity standards that we hope will be a really valuable resource for state officials and others. We have the interactive map, and then we have these more detailed state-specific fact sheets that do go into a little bit more detail and have live links to additional resources that you might find useful. All right, I think we're ready for our discussion. Let me take a look at the questions that have come in. So Jeremy, we've got a question on really like what's the state of play today on clean electricity standards, and do we see any action in states right now? A lot of legislative sessions have actually started for the year. So folks are curious as to, is there actually any activity on clean electricity standards right now?
Thank you for the question. The answer is yes. There's a handful of states where their kind of clean electricity standards is in the air. One is Colorado, where there's active discussion on legislation in the state about updating Colorado's CES. So if folks want to click the link that was just provided in the chat, you can go to the interactive map that Paula was showing and bring up Colorado and see what its current standard is. And there's, like I said, talk about updating that. In New York, the legislature recently passed a mandate for 100% net zero emissions by 2040, and the Public Service Commission is developing a CES framework for how to achieve that legislative target. In Pennsylvania, there's been talk for a number of years of updating the state's RPS, which is called the Alternative Energy Portfolio Standard. Governor Shapiro introduced a proposal last year. Shorthand, it's called PRESS, that would expand Pennsylvania's existing policy to include and encompass a wider range of technologies. And so we may see continued and ongoing discussion in Pennsylvania on kind of the next step for that state's power sector standards. In New Jersey, for the past couple of years, there's been discussion about a clean electricity standard. It did not pass last year. That's a state to watch, whether that comes back up, but there's an opportunity there. And then in Maryland, a couple of years ago, the legislature passed a 100% net zero electricity requirement and tossed the ball to the Energy Administration to do a report and make recommendations on how that could be achieved. And the Maryland Energy Administration just released that report after, I think, 2 years of work. I believe that report was released within the past month or so in January. And it identified the need to meet increase in load with clean generation and a number of ideas. And so I think that's another state where a clean electricity standard is an option for how to help the state meet its clean electricity goals. So a number of, that's a handful of states right there where there are kind of live conversations or it's in the air. And then there's a second category of states like Michigan, North Carolina, and some others that have had recently passed clean electricity standards, and there's ongoing implementation to make sure that the state is actually on track or to achieve the targets, or in some cases catching up because it's behind on achieving some of the targets.
Thank you, Jeremy. And just as a reminder for folks, if you do have questions, feel free to type them in the question and answer box, and I will be sure to ask the panelists those questions. Okay, we've got two coming in here. Kasparis, I'm going to toss this one over to you. I spoke a little bit about some of the advanced design features that we're starting to see kind of bubbling up around clean electricity standards. And I'm really curious, I talked a little bit about the hourly requirement versus the annual, but I didn't go into a lot of detail on the clean capacity standard. Can you tell folks what that would entail and what the underlying purpose of that type of standard would be?
Yeah, thanks, Paula. Happy to discuss a little bit. So the underlying purpose here is, traditional clean electricity or energy standards have driven a lot of deployment of wind and solar, and to some extent battery storage as well, in states. The challenge that we're seeing, especially when looking towards achieving high levels of decarbonization, is that there are other technologies that could be playing, a more critical role of supplying clean electricity when the wind isn't blowing or the sun isn't shining. In these hours, generally, you also have the ramping up of kind of old, more high emitting generators. So there's also an incentive to reduce those generator emissions, especially from the perspective of air quality. And so a clean capacity standard is the idea that in addition to just generating raw electricity, you may want to start thinking about providing incentives to replace some of the firm capacity with reliable, clean capacity. As you noted, this could be replacing certain power plants with clean, firm technologies like geothermal or nuclear. But these incentives would also go towards incentivizing things like demand response or long duration energy storage. And so, historically, states have incentivized the replacement of emitting generation with clean generation. And now I think there's a growing appetite to start thinking about advanced features to provide incentives for capacity, not just generation. And I think this is also very relevant today, given the fast load growth that we're seeing across the country. People are trying to think about how to both meet reliability, affordability, and emission goals at the same time. And so this is one of the potential tools for states to consider.
That's great. Thank you, Kasparis. All right, we have another question, and this is relating to the changes we're seeing at the federal level with the new administration coming in. And this particular attendee is interested in whether some of the changes we are seeing at the federal level, for example, possible revision of the IRA or other kind of administrative actions to roll back implementation of the IRA. Do we think those changes will impact clean electricity standards at the state level? Jeremy, can you answer that one or kick it off for us, and then others can type in?
Sure, we'll kick it off. Yes, may see repeal of IRA provisions, namely tax credits that benefit a number of clean energy, zero emission or low emission technologies. And so that additional incentive for doing a CES, those may get pulled back. Some of them may be sustained. So, with technologies like geothermal or nuclear and others, it may not be a wholesale repeal of those provisions. That's kind of an ongoing battle and discussion at the federal level in terms of IRA defense. Even without the IRA tax credits, there are still the same advantages of a clean electricity standard in terms of lowering, that I mentioned at the top, in terms of lowering risk for customers, lower system costs long term, providing incentives for technology deployment. So the kind of the benefits and the offerings of a clean electricity standard were not dependent on the federal tax incentives that came under the Biden administration. As the chart from Berkeley Lab shows, there's been action since the late 90s and into the 2000s, even before the IRA, of moving RPSs and CESs. But I think, just a couple more benefits of doing it now. One, even if there is less action at the federal level or repeal of some of the tax credits, doing clean electricity standards at the state level helps continue to deploy these innovative technologies and commercially available technologies. It brings jobs, brings investment into the state. Decarbonizing the power sector is critical for decarbonizing our national economy and global decarbonization, because a lot of other sectors like transportation and industry, decarbonizing them involves electrification. And so you need to have a clean electricity supply. And then, this, again, the clean electricity standard provides an incentives to continue reducing emissions at the power sector. And it does that regardless of federal action.
Any other panelists want to add to something that Jeremy said?
I'll just very briefly follow up by saying that, in addition, as Jeremy has pointed out, some of the ways in which it might not all things happening at the federal level might not all be negative, particularly with some of the technologies that are included in clean electricity standards, but not in renewable portfolio standards. Just also mention that building out the transmission infrastructure across the country is really important for integrating more both renewable and clean firm sources into the grid and taking the electricity to where it's needed, and that there is, perhaps some appetite for the kind of permitting and environmental review reforms at the federal level that might enable faster build out of that kind of transmission. And there was just a hearing at the Senate EPW yesterday in which our colleague Nicole Tapia spoke about that. So there's perhaps some areas where things could happen at the federal level that would still be helpful for state CES program.
That's great. Kasparas, can you follow up a little bit on what Sean just said in terms of, transmission and associated infrastructure needs? Because I know that could differ between your, renewable energy sources versus some of these clean firm technologies that do tend to be more energy dense than renewable technologies, and what the impact of, infrastructure needs could be by having a CES that encourages this broader suite of technologies.
Yeah, sure. Happy to comment on that. I think there's growing kind of broad recognition that different technologies have trade-offs, right? Some require more infrastructure to be deployed, and others require less. Some of the clean firm options that we work on and encourage to be included as a consideration, have potential benefits of having lower land use footprints and requiring less transmission to bring the electrons from the sources to the data centers. And so if you are in a scenario where you might be coming up on existing speed limits or barriers for deploying certain infrastructure, other technologies might provide clean electricity, but come at different requirements for infrastructure build out. Now, sometimes there are other trade-offs, right? It's not the easiest thing to get a new nuclear plant, developed in certain areas, and so it's really a trade-off. But I think the key thing here is there needs to be a lot of effort to deploy as much clean electricity as possible using kind of all potential sources that are truly clean. But states need to be, I think, strategic and think of ways that they could potentially also reduce the amount of infrastructure that needs to be built to hit targets, as long as they're also still complying with emission, affordability, reliability, and so on. So I guess in summary, the key thing here is to be strategic and look at all options, and really do consider how certain technologies that are, historically haven't been deployed as much, could really lessen some of these barriers, as well as working on the barriers actively, as Sean pointed out.
Thank you. Appreciate that. All right, we've got a couple more questions rolling in. Let's try this one. Does a state need to meet certain criteria to be a, quote, good candidate for a CES? Jeremy, you want to take that one?
Sure. Interesting, good candidate. That phrase. I think in terms of being a good CES, what we look for is a binding kind of obligation on the covered units. Increasing and it being strong, increasing stringency over time, and getting to really 100%. So those are some of the things I mentioned at the top. Good candidate for CES. One of the things in doing this project that we really scrutinized and talked about internally is kind of what makes a CES, and there's some RPSs that include additional technologies, and is that enough to be a CES? And there's different types of CESs, and so that's how we got to kind of we did debate about whether this is CES or not a CES. I think ultimately the most important thing is the target, the stringency, the long-term, near-term directionality, and being technology neutral. That provides real visibility to customers, to utilities, to generators, and so that they know the rules of the road going forward. So I'd be interested, please, if y'all have feedback as you get into our report, and particularly the map, as you have feedback or questions about how we categorize the CESs, we'd really welcome that, because it's something we thought a lot about. And ultimately, I think found a little bit of clarity in the categorization of an energy-based CES and an emissions-based CES. And we found that most of the two kind of fall in one of those two buckets.
Yeah. And I'll also just add that, we see a range of states that have adopted these policies. It's not just one kind of state, a large state or small state, or, a state in this region or a state in that region. When you look at the map, you see, renewable portfolio standards and now clean electricity standards really across the country, in states that all have unique challenges, diverse portfolios, and their own, interests for their particular jurisdiction. So I don't think you have to, be a state that looks a certain way, for example, to adopt a CES. I think we've seen diverse states adopt these policies across the last 5 to 10 years. Let's see, Sean, how does a CES enable states to balance working towards their clean energy goals, but also while prioritizing affordability and reliability? And then, if there's anyone else who wants to answer that too, please feel free.
Sure. Thanks, Paula. I would say, the idea of a CES is that it is supposed to be allowing utilities to use as broad a range of zero emitting or low emitting technologies as possible. And as a result, providing that flexibility makes it easier for utilities to comply while still ensuring that they are providing, reliable and affordable electricity. And the reliability side in particular, a CES typically will include more what we refer to as clean firm sources, as opposed to an RPS, which typically relies primarily on intermittent sources. And so that by including sources like geothermal or nuclear that can provide that base load or clean firm power, then you're helping to support reliability. And then finally, as we talked about earlier in the design elements, there are various ways that states can build in some flexibility to make adjustments along the way if they do encounter problems with reliability or affordability. So these programs have really been designed to make it easier to get to 100% while ensuring reliability and affordability, and then also to make changes if necessary along the way.
Any additions from the other panelists?
Nope.
All right, we do have a few other questions, but I think in the interest of time, I'm going to stop the questions there, but I do want to bring up one more slide for Jeremy to talk about with this crew.
Thanks, Paula. Really appreciate the strong attendance on this webinar. Our next state policy webinar is going to be on March 26th. That one is going to focus on clean, firm electricity supply and load growth. Two topics top of mind for many of us. I'll remind folks who may not be aware that CATF, I hope as you see, we have deep expertise on the power sector. We also have a state policy team that has a presence in all regions of the country, in the Northeast, in the Southeast, Midwest, and the Gulf Coast, and in the Western United States, including California. So please reach out to us if you have any questions about CESs or any other topic. We'd love to continue working with you and just be a resource for whatever your goals are in your state. Thank you so much for joining, and we look forward to seeing you next time.
Thanks so much, everybody.